Adjunct Professor Moran, Microeconomics 112. In our last session, we discussed the difference between a firm that hires in a purely competitive market, and we distinguished that from a monopsonist, where there's only one firm hiring labor. And we discovered that when that's true, there will be a difference between the wage rate and the marginal resource cost of labor. So, in a purely competitive market, wage rates are set by supply and demand. And the wage rate will be the equilibrium, and the individual firm will have a purely elastic supply curve of labor at the wage rate set by the market. But the monopsonist has this split between the marginal resource cost, which in a purely competitive market is equal to supply. It's not equal in a monopsony. They have a split between marginal resource cost and the supply curve, which is where the wage is read from. So at any one quantity of labor, there will be a difference between the marginal resource cost and the wage rate, which is read from the supply curve. Why is that true? So what is going to be the wage and quantity determinant for a monopsonist? Go back and look at the prior video if you need to understand the difference between the wage rate and the marginal resource cost. When we graph it, we'll have this split. So the monopsonist, as the pure competitor, will find where marginal revenue product, the demand curve, and the marginal resource cost of the quantity of input occurs. Here, in this area where at any quantity the marginal revenue product is exceeding the marginal resource cost, workers will get hired. They're contributing more to the business than it's costing the business to hire the extra workers. But once we pass that equilibrium with marginal resource cost equals the marginal revenue product, now workers are costing more. Marginal cost of hiring additional units of input is higher than the additional revenue these workers are bringing in, so they won't get hired. So the firm will hire at marginal revenue product equals marginal resource cost. When you find that point, go down and get the quantity of labor hired. So far, so good. The same as a purely competitive industry. But because the marginal resource cost and the supply curves are not equal for a monopsonist, review this table, then the firm at this quantity of labor, which is desired because of marginal revenue product equals marginal resource cost, this number of workers can be hired at a lower amount, at this amount read from the supply curve, because given the supply curve, this quantity of labor can be hired at that wage rate. So this will be the wage rate for the monopsonist, not where marginal revenue cost equals marginal revenue product. Notice that under conditions of pure competition, the supply curve would also equal the marginal resource cost, which would equal the wage rate. In a purely competitive industry, the wage rate would be higher, and the number of workers would be greater. But that will not be the case for a monopsonist. Again, for a monopsonist, there will be split between marginal resource cost and the supply curve from which the wage rate is read. We'll find marginal revenue product equals to marginal resource cost, go down to get the quantity of labor hired. The wage rate will be read from the supply curve, which is lower than this index, which you don't refer to at all, just find the quantity of labor from that. And then, when it hits the supply curve, go over and get the wage rate. Now what we're going to do is we're going to introduce the concept of unions and see what impact that has on wage rates and quantity of workers hired. Okay, there are different ways that unions can encourage higher wage rates. Unions exist for only two reasons: to get higher wages or better benefits. One way of increasing the wage rate is called demand enhancement. Demand enhancement is when the union takes out advertisements to buy a certain product. Competitve, who was someone in the 60s and 70s that tried to organize field workers in farms, took out an advertising program to have people persuade customers to buy only grapes made by union workers. That would increase the demand for the product, which would then increase the demand for the input, since input demand is derived from the demand for the output. So, if this were a perfectly competitive industry, the demand curve for the input would shift. This is quantity of input, and that would lead to a higher wage rate and more workers hired. economic textbooks say this is theoretically the best, but it's very hard to do because when faced with a choice between a more expensive product and an identical product at a lower price, many consumers will not buy the higher priced product to support unionized workers. It seeks to increase the demand for labor by increasing the demand for the product, and it increases both the quantity and the wage rate of labor. And it's going to do that by increasing the demand for the product. You can also do this by increasing the productivity of your input, and that will, if you increase the productivity of a resource, then the demand for the product, the resource will go up, causing an increase in the wage rate and increase the quantity. For a monopsonist, it is the same effect. You'll have a shift in the demand curve. Keep in mind that these demand curves are the marginal revenue product. And so the demand curve shifts, and that will result originally Originally it was the marginal revenue product and marginal resource cost. This is the intersection, but this is the wage rate and quantity of labor. But now, with the shift in demand, here is the marginal resource cost. Marginal revenue product shifted. Now you go down until you find the supply curve. Here's your wage rate, and here's your quantity. So here also it accounts for a higher wage rate and a greater quantity. Another way that unions can affect wage rates is through an exclusive or craft union. They need to control the supply of labor here. Exclusive or craft unions are examples of electricians, carpenters, and teachers, where in order to get hired, you have to be certified. Right? And so you've effectively reduced the supply of labor. You may have an equally qualified person who does not have a certification, who's not in the union. And so you've restricted the supply. In a purely competitive industry, that shifts the supply curve to the left, causing a higher wage rate and a lower number of workers hired. In a monopsonist, our marginal resource cost curves and supply curve shift to the left. So here's supply curve 1, marginal resource cost 1. Originally, you find marginal resource cost equal to demand curve, which equals marginal revenue product, marginal resource product, and then you go down until you hit the wage rate. So there's the wage rate originally, and here's the quantity of labor hired. But once you can restrict the supply by requiring certification of workers, you've reduced the supply, and you've shifted the curves this way. Now, marginal revenue product, demand, equals marginal resource cost here, get the wage from the supply curve, and go down, and you'll see that the quantity of labor is reduced, although the wages are higher. Another example of unions is something called an inclusive or industrial union. All the workers in the plant, regardless of skill, will be included in the union. This is like General Motors, large factories, industrial companies like that. You have to be able to go on strike in order to enforce this. Here you get the company to agree to a higher wage rate than equilibrium, because if the employer does not pay the higher wage rate, the union will withhold labor and close the factory down. So at this point they negotiate, neither supply nor demand changes. The employer agrees to pay a higher wage rate than at a pure competitive. What this means is the higher wage rate will attract more workers. Again, this is quantity of input, so this is supply of workers. At that wage rate, more workers will be attracted to this industry, but because of the higher wage rate, the demand for workers will be less, so fewer workers will be hired. Under conditions of pure competition, the wage rate will be here, the number of workers supplied will equal the number of workers demanded, and that will be the equilibrium quantity. But in an inclusive or industrial union model, the wage rate will be higher, which is the goal of the union, but the number of workers hired by the industry will be less. Finally, what happens if you have a union versus a monopsony? This is called a bilateral monopoly, because if there's only one hirer of workers and there's only one seller of workers, the union, you have basically two monopolies going against each other, a monopsony versus a union. The actual wage cannot be predicted by theory. it will be someplace between the wage the monopsonist wants to pay from the supply curve and the wage the union wants to be paid, which is in accordance with marginal resource cost equals marginal revenue product. The union will want to push that wage up to where the worker is paid what they contribute to the business. The union would love it if they could go up here, but they're not going to get that. So now notice that the monopsonist, the union wants the wage rate to be equal to the marginal revenue product equals the marginal resource cost, this quantity of labor. The monopsony will want to find that point but not pay that wage rate. They'll want to pay the wage rate consistent with the supply curve. Depending on who's got more power, the wage rate will either approximate more the marginal resource cost, marginal revenue product, which is favorable for the union, or if the employer is more powerful, it'll more approximate the wage rate under monopsony. Notice, however, what they're fighting about is they're fighting between the area where a purely competitive market would set the price, where supply equals demand. In our next video, we'll practice with this a little bit to see these different scenarios and graph them as a worksheet.